session hosted by the UK Trade and Business Commission. Welcome to my fellow commissioners, but welcome in particular to our panelists who are going to contribute in turn, and we have questions which we think are pertinent and helpful in eliciting some of the answers. And I'd like just to introduce our panelists briefly, and then we'll go straight into the session. So thank you very much for our witnesses, for all of them, for coming. The first is Matthew Percival, who's the Director of the Future of Work and Skills at the CBI, looking after their policy on the interactions between employers and their workforce, making sure the UK is a great place to create jobs and invest in people, particularly education, training. I mean, all the things you would think of. Matthew's been at the CBI since 2011, so is absolutely well qualified to talk about the position from an employer's point of view, but having engaged with lots of other stakeholders. Secondly, we have Brian Bell, hugely important role as the chair of the Migration Advisory Committee, probably ever more important in the days ahead, given the politics of our country, Professor of Economics at King's Business School, and has been involved as an Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at Oxford, and has been a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation, as well as engagement at the LSE. And he's a labour economist. We've heard him often, we've seen him often, we've read things that he's written often, but his particular role as the chair of the Migration Advisory Committee is obviously hugely timely. And then thank you very much to the third person, Charlie Robinson, Head of Global Mobility Policy at Universities UK, obviously a centrally positioned organisation. I speak as a Chancellor of a university and understand absolutely how crucial they are. Charlie's been at UK since 2021, and the whole set of issues about international student recruitment, about the impact of fees on international students, about the effect of Brexit on student mobility, as well as all these issues, make that contribution one that we're really looking forward to, Charlie. So we're really grateful for your participation. We have prepared a set of questions, and we're going to go straight into those immediately. I think pretty well all of our commissioners are able to stay through. One may have to dip out just a little before the end, but I'm going to hand over immediately to my colleague, Karma Elliott, who's going to ask the first question, I think, to all of you. Karma, over to you. Thank you.
I am. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Simon. And thank you, panelists, for joining us for this very important discussion, very timely and important. Perhaps starting with Charlie, could you just set out for us what are the most significant opportunities the UK-EU Youth Experience Scheme could create for young people, and what risks should policymakers be aware of? So Charlie, and then followed by Brian, and then our final panelist, Matthew.
I think the Youth Experience Scheme is an example of something that could be really mutually beneficial, reducing barriers to mobility of young people between the UK and Europe, and providing young people, British young people, with really valuable opportunities to live, study, train and work in Europe. Our research at UK shows that students, higher education students who go abroad as part of their degree, they have better academic outcomes, they have better employment outcomes and higher earnings on graduation than students who are not mobile. So I think, you know, in addition to those kind of employability benefits, living, working, studying abroad, we know it creates personal resilience, independence, intercultural and language skills. So there are a range of benefits that derive to students. I think since the ending of freedom of movement, we've seen very big two-way visa barriers. We've seen visa delays for UK students being a big problem for students going out, as well as those coming in. UK students have had to navigate a whole array of 27 different visa systems, so that's been a problem. And for incoming students, we've seen the lack of a designated internship visa route being a big problem for EU interns coming in. And although we don't have hard data on it, from our European partners, we've heard that their EU intern schemes have been decimated. I think as well as filling kind of short-term labour gaps, there's a real opportunity for the UK business in becoming a destination for really talented EU interns in high skill areas again. And obviously any scheme that opens up work and training opportunities across Europe for UK youngsters can deliver against the government's skills agendas. I think in terms of the risk for policymakers, then I think there's a big challenge here around genuine reciprocity, what the EU wants and what the UK wants, and where there might be some, difference between them. I think as part of a youth experience scheme, the EU has been really clear that it wants preferential access to the UK higher education sector and to return to some kind of pre-Brexit financial arrangements there. I think for the UK side, the key benefit for us as a higher education sector is removing all the administrative barriers around visas. So the fee element is really less important to us. I think there's also, in the context of migration concerns in the government's white paper, a real question around numbers in and numbers out. I know we're going to talk about migration later, but I think that's going to be a challenge for the policy design of the scheme. And I think that given that the youth experience scheme seems to be essential to making, progress on other parts of the deal, the UK may need to make some kind of trade-off on migration policy priorities and economic ones. But I think there's still a real question about whether the UK offer, even at its most generous, is going to be acceptable to the EU side, if what it's actually seeking to replicate is the kind of arrangements it had before Brexit. And I would argue that a youth experience scheme can't really fix that. So I think the challenge is really trying to get onto the same page about what kind of relationship the UK is going to have with Europe. And given that we aren't on a trajectory to rejoin anytime soon, it's about, and that we're not an EU accession state. I think it's about kind of, what type of relationship is it that we're going to have?
Thank you very much, Charlie. Matthew, would you like to follow that?
Very happy to. Look, I think in terms of the broader impact of a scheme, the broader economic impact we'd see coming through what can it unlock through being a bit of a political olive branch, brewing some of that sort of trust in the discussions around how a future UK-EU relationship evolves. So we'd see the impact in the round in terms of the economic impact. In terms of specifically the impact for the young people who might be going on the schemes, I think one of the things that we've heard quite a bit about in recent years is where companies have had their early career development programs that operate in across borders, where they'll try and aggregate some of those schemes, particularly previously where they would have done them on a European basis. If those schemes are based in the UK, then British young people disproportionately get access to them. Whichever country hosts that element of that youth development scheme, whether it's based on apprenticeships or whether it's based on a graduate scheme, the host country gets more access to it than it would if it went into any other country. So there's a bit of a trade-off which says sometimes making it easier to be able to move young people on career development programs, whether academic or technical development programs, around within a company that operates in multiple countries, will mean that you can get more opportunities for British young people who might not even be using the mobility route themselves to be able to get onto those schemes if they're more likely to be located here. And that's something that we've certainly heard about. Some of those barriers to some of that shorter term mobility particularly bites there, and could be something that could be addressed through a youth experience scheme.
Thank you very much. And Brian, initial comments, please.
So, I mean, I think one shouldn't sort of over-egg how important any of this is for the economy or for jobs. I mean, unless the government comes up with a number that is utterly inconceivable for the size of the route, it's marginal to most things that matter in the UK. I mean, we issue 25,000 youth mobility visas at the moment per year. 35 million people work in the UK. Like, it's a drop in the ocean. So I don't think, I think one should focus, and we always have focused more on just the benefits to the individual, that actually it's all about that experience of going abroad, expanding your knowledge, your horizons. Even if you're just going to Australia, that's a different context, I suppose. And so I think there'll be real benefits just for the individuals involved, but in both directions. And so I think that's how you should think about this scheme, rather than as some way of solving some other problem that's in the UK. The risks, but the good news is the risks are actually pretty low as well. This is a route that really we don't have very strong concerns on in terms of abuse. You can't really abuse the route. I mean, once you've come, you're allowed to do pretty much anything for the 2 or 3 years that you're here. And all the evidence that I've seen suggests that kind of abuse of the route in terms of overstaying is very small, partly because of the countries that we choose to have these negotiations with. The number of people who subsequently claim asylum, having entered on this legal route, is very small again. So I think kind of policymakers can actually be quite relaxed about expanding the youth mobility scheme we already have for a number of other countries, without worrying too much about kind of the sort of abuse that we're seeing in other parts of the immigration system.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure government have fully
understood that message, but that's a very helpful country. Carla, do you want to come back to pick
any of those points?
No, thank you, Simon. I think I'll pass back to you.
Okay, thank you. So, second question from Jeff McKay. Do you want to do a different order? Perhaps start with Matthew, then Brian, then Charlie, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to pick that up, could we actually talk about what lessons can be learned from existing UK or EU youth mobility programmes to help the conversation and inform these negotiations, please?
Well, I think the main thing that we'd pick up would be the simpler you can be able to get the design of the schemes, the easier they are to use. And some of those benefits obviously come to the individual. The more barriers, the more complicated a scheme is for an individual, the less likely they are to put themselves forward for it. But also sometimes we see a bit of the benefits of this being there are some impacts around sort of which employers may also be able to access those people while they're in the country. And disproportionately, you'll find that SMEs will get a benefit out of these sorts of schemes where there are fewer controls around them, because often the cost of engaging with the UK's visa system, that first visa has a really high cost because you've got familiarity with the regime and making sure you've got all of the different compliance measures in place. If you're just looking to, access one person temporarily, often that's a barrier to engaging with the UK visa routes. And therefore, if someone's already in the country with an ability to work, often there'll be businesses that might be able to offer that person a job that would not otherwise have been able to justify the cost of engaging with a visa route. So there's some benefits in simplicity there that I think would be helpful. And the other thing that we're conscious of is sort of thinking about reciprocity in the round in these schemes. Sometimes that's through the scheme in isolation, but in this case, I think not getting too hung up on that and remembering that actually a lot of the advantage for the UK in the design of this is, if this is something that the EU particularly wants within the negotiation, what does it unlock getting on to talking about in other aspects of the UK-EU relationship? So don't only measure reciprocity narrowly through ins and outs of numbers on this scheme alone, because that can often be sort of a ratchet down on the availability of those schemes and might hold us back from accessing some of the broader benefits.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Brian, can we just pick up on that as well? We're talking about lessons learned, but I'm also interested in the idea of simplicity and the benefit for SMEs. Would you like to just pick that up as a little extension, please?
Yeah, no, completely. So I'm always in favour of immigration systems being simple. That's not usually what we get when it goes through the lawyers. So simple is good. I mean, they are quite simple at the moment. So the schemes that we have with other countries, you're pretty much allowed to do anything once you enter the country for the 2 or 3 years that you're here. You can't be an international sports person is the main thing that you're banned from doing on the youth mobility scheme. So actually, that's a good model. A good model is just you've been accepted, you've paid the fees, you can then pretty much do what you want for those 3 years. I think that's the right model. It definitely helps SMEs. I think there's a really strong argument here that one of the benefits of this route, in many ways, it's like the graduate route that currently exists for students, that once you graduated from a UK university, you can stay for up to 2 years at the moment on a graduate route and again, do almost anything you want. The good thing about that is because you're not subject to immigration controls, firms don't have to worry about, you have the right to work, so firms don't have to engage with the Home Office. And so smaller firms who don't have sponsorship licenses, don't use the normal immigration work routes, can actually use this. So it's much more attractive for your local coffee shop than it is for PwC, who can bring in workers. They already have all the systems in place. So it's much more attractive for them. So there is a real benefit. I mean, the reality is we don't have good data on this, but we sort of know that the big gainers in terms of sectors of the economy that will use youth mobility of people coming in are hospitality and retail. So, that's where these workers are predominantly going to work, and they're disproportionately SME as well. So there's a real benefit there.
Thanks very much, Brian. Charlie, just to pick up the lessons learned and also the opportunities possibly linked to what you do as well, please.
Yeah, I think to echo what others said, I think simplicity is really key. I would agree that the existing YMS schemes are a good template in that respect. I think it's really important that it's a straightforward, it's a visa route, it's a straightforward application to the Home Office, and applications to study are an entirely separate and independent process. We'd want to keep it that way. I think the existing routes flexibility, as others have said, is really, really important. I think the fact that it doesn't require sponsorship, it will be absolutely key for it to tick the box for European stakeholders in regards inbound internships, which has been really important to them. I think for us as a higher education sector, I think critically, the fact that the existing schemes do not create a financial burden for universities or on the public purse in terms of access to student loans or preferential fee access. That's really, a really, really important feature of the existing schemes that we want to see in any youth experience scheme.
Thanks very much, Charlie. So I think overall, make it simple and make it clear. Back to you, Chair, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And now, John, I think you have questions to Matthew and Brian, but over to you.
Well, indeed, a question to all three of the colleagues. I'm John Clark, a former European Commission trade negotiator. My questions are following. How might this youth experience scheme, and in particular the foreseen 2-year negotiation of it, interact with the rest of the UK and the EU's broader trade agenda and the negotiations which are taking place in several other areas? And is it helpful that this youth experience scheme negotiation is linked or packaged with other areas of the trade relationship, or is it possible or desirable that it be go ahead on its own merits? So maybe if Charlie Robinson could come in first on that, and then Brian and Matthew.
I think from our lens, speaking from the higher education sector, I think the fact that the EU has been clear that other areas of a trade deal are contingent on some concessions on the youth experience scheme, I think that our concern, it potentially, if it depends on kind of how hardline the EU wants to be on things like fees and loans and things. The finance element is the real stumbling block for us. So I think the fact that it's kind of tied in, an SPS deal may be tied in with this is, there's a risk there. I think from our perspective, it's absolutely vital that the UK government does not give way on the fees and funding issue. We've got the modern industrial strategy states in really big letters the universities are vital to and will play a critical role in delivering the strategy. We're going to do that through job creation, skills, through world-leading research and innovation. The total economic impact of the higher education and research sector stood at approximately 265 billion in 2021-2022. Every £1 of public investment into universities generates £14 in economic output. We can't do this if the sector is financially on its knees. So I think we're really clear that that can't be part. The government just needs to think really carefully about that. So I think that would be our perceived risk in kind of having these things coupled.
Thanks. Brian, you have anything to contribute to this?
In one sense, I'd like it to be almost independent. I'd like us to think about what's the right immigration policy and then think about other policies. But that's not how trade negotiations work, and that's fine. That there are trade-offs. I think kind of it's hard to see why the UK government would want to do something very different than the deals we already have with other countries. There is a principle that we've got in the immigration system now, which is we are neutral with respect to nationality. We don't say that French people are better than Mexicans when it comes to our immigration system, which of course we did under the EU, when we were in the EU. And so if we came up with a youth mobility scheme that was very different than the ones we already have, and very much more preferential in terms of, not having an immigration health surcharge or having fee access to universities, that kind of thing, I think there'd be a concern that we were going back to a world in which we were giving preferential treatment to Europeans relative to other nationalities. And there's no obvious reason in the immigration system why you would do that. But it might be that you do that because you want a trade negotiation, and that's the trade-off you have. And I don't think there's any, government should work out for themselves what they want to do in that, and they should trade off those things. So even, questions about university funding, they're part of the negotiation. And, it may well be that we decide in the end that that's a better thing to do because we want something else on trade. That's just life. And I think we have to live with that. But I do think the starting point should probably be, let's try and think about whether we shouldn't just replicate what we've already got with other countries, which works well, is not a game changer for the economy as a whole, but is fine and seems to be working.
Thanks very much. That's interesting. Matthew?
Well, picking up on a point that Brian was making, when businesses think about migration alone as well, the first point is normally, can we hire domestically? Can we train domestically? If we can't achieve our needs through that way, then are there routes to be able to bring people in from overseas? And businesses would also be thinking not on like a country by country basis of what I really need is a worker from country X rather than from country Y. It's about what they can offer while they're here instead. But when you're thinking about this scheme coming in the context of a broader negotiation, it becomes a question of, should the UK government be willing to adapt elements of its migration and visa regime in order to access the wider benefits of a trading relationship, where the trading relationships with some countries are worth more and more valuable than with others. And if that creates differences in approaches to visa regimes for different countries, can it be justified on the grounds of a broader national interest? And I would say yes, it can, rather than being stuck on a sort of a purist migration and migration alone thought of everything needs to be the same everywhere. It's the economic rationale and what it might unlock for you. I guess what you'd need is enough confidence that it's going to unlock something of sufficient value to then be able to say this now then justifies adding what would be to some extent some complexity to have different youth mobility schemes that operate in different ways with different countries. But let's not be so afraid of having different things for different countries that we choose to turn down economic opportunities in order to try and say we've got a simple system somewhere else.
Thanks very much. I think this has been a very, very useful and interesting set of interventions. I take from this several positives. One is that this is being seen as a trade negotiation, not a question of immigration policy or stop the boats. I think it's very good that the experience scheme is situated in that sort of space. Secondly, there'll be a big debate about the extent of EU preference. I think that's inevitable. And thirdly, I think all of you, recognise that this is going to be linked to other areas of the TCA negotiations and the summit agenda. There will be linkages, and we have to try and make those positive linkages rather than negative ones. But both the UK and the EU, I think, will need to think much more carefully about how those linkages are going to interact. I think we're not there yet. So I'll back over to you, Chairman. Thank you very much, everybody.
John, thank you very much. That's a very, very good envelope to put those answers in. Much appreciated. So I'm going to hand over next to our colleague Rachel Blake, who's the Labour and Cooperative MP for none less place than the cities of London and Westminster. Rachel.
Thank you very much, Chair. We've touched on a bit of this already, but it'd be useful to explore what you believe the impact on net migration would be. It'd be helpful to start with you, Brian, please.
The $1 million question. I mean, roughly, my answer is not much at all. Although I should preface that by saying, of course, you can only answer that question when you know what the policy would be. I mean, let's think of it in its simplest. Suppose we had a scheme that was capped, and it was capped at, say, 50,000 people a year. let's suppose that would be a reasonably generous cap relative to the overall usage at the moment. So if we had 50,000, could I imagine 50,000 Brits going to Europe every year? Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a reasonable thing to assume. So you get 50,000 Europeans coming here. The impact on net migration is exactly zero in every single year. So because the numbers going in and going out are the same. And the only effect you ever have in that world is that some people will be able to switch visas after they've finished the youth mobility scheme onto other visas and stay in the long term. Perhaps the most obvious ones are you might end up studying, you might end up getting a job, or you might fall in love and start a family in the UK while you're here. But of course, that will also be applying to the Brits who go abroad. And so entirely possible that they just have the same probability of staying abroad as we do. And, people forget that Brits count in the net migration statistics. So if it's a balanced scheme, my guess is the overall effect on net migration is essentially zero, essentially all the time. And so it's not worth worrying about. Of course, the answer is very different if it's an uncapped scheme. And the reason it's very different is that there are 6 or 7 times as many Europeans as there are Brits. So if the probability of wanting to move is the same for Brits as it is for Europeans, you'd have 7 times as many Europeans coming here as leaving. In that world, suppose 50,000 Brits wanted to go every year, the equivalent will be 350,000 Europeans arriving. Net migration will be 300,000 up in the first 3 years of the scheme when you're getting the new cohorts arriving. And you'd have 900,000 additional people in the UK once you'd got to steady state. That would be a big effect on net migration. I have to say that is utterly implausible. The government would be in breach, very clear breach of its manifesto commitment to reduce net migration if it agreed to anything like that. So I just don't think that's possible. I don't think any political party would actually, or any politician that's likely to be in power would agree to that. So I think it's either going to be capped at a reasonably lower level, or there's going to be some cap that works that it doesn't get to that kind of level. So yes, net migration could be very high in this scenario, but it would require a completely uncapped scheme and very large flows from the EU. Which, are possible. And just to highlight, they are possible. So if you think of the UK and the Australian scheme at the moment, it's theoretically capped, but the cap is never hit. But actually, net migration is helped from the UK's perspective by that scheme, because only about 10,000 Australians come in every year and about 30,000 Brits go to Australia every year. That's partly because we're about 3 times the size of Australia. And so actually assuming that the probabilities of wanting to go are about the same is not a bad assumption in that example. And therefore, you'd get this very different flow between the EU and the UK. It would be harmful because of the size of the EU. So I think realistically, there's going to have to be a cap if you want to control net migration. And any reasonable cap will probably mean that net migration will be around about zero.
Thanks. I'm interested that you drew on the size of a country to inform your assessment of flows. Is there any other evidence that you can draw on? I would suggest to you maybe economic evidence in terms of how appealing it might be to move, cultural evidence in terms of patterns of interest of moving to different places for different experiences, or in your great experience and knowledge, is just size of country the only real evidence base to inform the scale of the flows?
It's definitely not the only evidence base, although just as an anecdote, it's interesting to note that in last year we issued 1 youth mobility scheme visa to Monaco, even though the cap is 1,000, because it's so small that only one Monaco's person wanted to come to the UK. So size, I think, is very important. The other two, but I would have economic development really matters, and that's why I think Australia is a better comparator than other countries in the scheme for what might happen to Europe, because after all, on average, we're about the same economic development as the EU as a whole. Similar to Australia. And so, in other words, there won't be lots of French people saying, I want to go to the UK because wages are better and employment is better. There might be a few from poorer parts of the EU, but I mean, overall, the flows are not going to be dominated by that economics in the way that they are. For example, we have a young professional scheme with India, which is their equivalent to the youth mobility scheme. That's capped at 3,000, and there's a ballot to issue those 3,000 visas. The Home Office, I don't think, have publicly said how many people applied for the ballot, but as I understand it from media reports, it's massively oversubscribed. That's exactly, of course, India is a very big country as well, so you might expect it even just on size. But of course, also there's an economic advantage there because you actually get paid a lot more on average in the UK than you do in India. So I think because we're comparing ourselves with countries that are more economically at the same level as we are, you wouldn't expect the flows to be dominated primarily by economics. And therefore, population is actually probably the main driver of how many you'd get.
And any evidence, sorry, just to push this, any evidence beyond size and economics in terms of education opportunities or cultural opportunities? Those are the two main.
Yeah, to be honest, that's a big gap in our data. We just don't know who comes on the Youth Mobility Scheme. I mean, we know their age and we know what country they're from, but then we don't do anything, you know. So for example, we don't at the moment know what they do when they're in the UK. So we don't know how much they earn. We don't know whether they're working. So actually there's a big gap that we'd like to fill with better data to actually just answer some of those questions that you have.
Thanks. Charlie, anything to add?
I think I would I think agree with everything that Brian has said. I think, CAP is going to be really important. I think even noting that even if there were a kind of imbalance in a CAP scheme, even where you would have an imbalance of numbers, you would expect it to reach a steady state in terms of net migration once you start to see, people emigrating at similar rates. If it's a temporary visa route, it's capped. Even if there is some kind of imbalance in numbers, I think that, you would see things kind of reach steady state after a number of years. I think also just picking up on that point about the numbers of people who might kind of move through onto other visa routes, I would expect it to have kind of a smaller impact than other kind of work or study routes. First, youth experience scheme visa holders, they'd not be eligible for the graduate route, which is itself a temporary visa class. I think the changes to the skilled work routes will make it kind of harder to progress into skilled work. And I think we've seen data from existing youth mobility scheme visas. So people coming on those schemes from Australia, Canada and New Zealand in 2019, of those, about 15% had moved into long-term work visas by the end of 2023. 6% had moved onto a family visa. So you only had about 1/5 still in the UK after 5 years. Of course, that doesn't necessarily track through into settlement as well. So I think you'd also have to assume, that some of these people moving into skilled work visas from a youth experience scheme would be coming in place of people applying from outside the UK or coming from other internal UK visa routes. So I think in general, while the impact of youth mobility scheme, on kind of longer-term population trends might not be zero, we should assume it would be relatively small and certainly smaller than other visa categories with a more direct path to settlement. So I think, I'd second that point around the idea that it's kind of not going to have huge population impacts.
Very much. Back to you, Chair.
Rachel, thanks very much. Charlie, perhaps you can later just share with us the figures that you've got which show foreign student numbers over the last reasonable number of years, say 3 years, from EU countries coming into this country as far as you have them, and other student numbers from outside the EU. I think it would just be interesting to help us inform the debate, and anything else you think that would add value to our consideration. Thank you. I know you as an organisation, the masters and mistresses of all these data. So Tamara, over to you, please. Tamara Kinchik with our next question.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is, how do you see youth mobility impacting the UK's ongoing skills shortages, particularly in sectors like hospitality, tourism and tech? And just from my personal interest as well, I'm going to also add fashion manufacturing, because we lost a lot of skills post-Brexit. So first of all, to you, Brian, please.
Well, I mean, in one sense, again, of course, it depends on the numbers. Again, just to hammer home the point, 35 million people work in the UK. So work out how big the scheme is and then work out what a percentage of change in employment is. The numbers are going to be really tiny. Like, in my view, if we end up with 350,000 Europeans, net of the UK people who leave and go abroad on the youth mobility scheme, if the net number is 350,000 over a 3-year period, that's 1% of the UK workforce. So it's kind of irrelevant. to anything macro sort of focused. That won't necessarily be true at individual sector levels. So there will be some sectors that will benefit from it. So, whenever I talk to the hospitality sector, one of their big requests is a youth mobility scheme, because they probably quite rightly guess that the majority of people who come from Europe are going to be in their early 20s. I mean, youth is now defined up to 35 for some unknown reason, but they're probably mainly going to be in their early 20s. They're going to want to be working probably mainly in London, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow. They're going to be wanting to work in pubs, in restaurants, because they're probably not going to want to work full time. They're probably going to be doing a kind of a part-time job while enjoying the cultural kind of experience of being in a different country. So I think those sectors will benefit. Of course, they'll also lose a bit, because the Brits that are going will probably have done some of that work as well. Perhaps this is my bias, but I assume lots of people will be going to work in French ski resorts using the youth mobility scheme. But if they hadn't gone there, they'd have probably worked in their local pub or something instead. And so I think, there's that net effect will be smaller, because I think you'll get the same thing. Where I think there's less clear evidence, and this is just where we don't really have good data, is whether many people who come on youth mobility schemes actually go into higher paying, higher skilled jobs. Clearly they can. I mean, there's no reason why you wouldn't. If you were a top tech worker, you could come on a youth mobility scheme, you could get a job with Google in London, and then you could progress eventually onto a skilled worker or global talent visa. You might do that. I mean, the probability is that you don't, because those workers are well enough paid that they can come anywhere on work visas. And the advantage of coming on a work visa is you're already accruing settlement entitlement, at least under the current rules. Whereas the youth mobility scheme, in one sense, is a wasted few years if you're going to want to go into that job anyway, because you just have years where you're not accruing the years that you need to get indefinite leave to remain. So I'm not sure how, and this is the question, as I say, we can do it theoretically. I think kind of one of our projects going forward is that we now have a link between visa records and HMRC pay records. And so theoretically, we can now we haven't done it, but we could look at the YMS people who are already in the country and see whether there's a tail of people who are high earners. There may well be, and they would obviously be quite different. But I think, overall, it's not going to be a game changer for skill shortages in the UK, but it'll help hospitality and retail, if anyone.
I mean, I had a researcher working for me who came on from Australia on this scheme, and she'd worked for Save the Children here and then came to work for me. And she has had a very good set of skills, and I've really benefited from having her on the team. But also, just to your point, before I go to the next person to ask, my understanding was that in the summer it was really hard for undergraduates to get jobs in hospitality, because there was a dearth of those jobs available anyway, because there's been a decline in that market. So it's a wider issue about, I mean, that's wider than the questions that we're asking here. It's a wider question perhaps about the economy. Well, with that bombshell, over to you, Matthew, to answer the same question.
To answer the economic bombshell question, but I broadly agree with Brian.
I'm skirting that one back to the
I broadly agree with the point Brian was making, which is we don't think about a youth experience scheme principally as justified on its impact on the labour market, because the reasonable assumption is any scheme will be designed with an intention to try and achieve a broadly zero net migration impact, and therefore the people going in and out, if they're of similar numbers, probably similar ages, you assume you're not having big distributional impact. Yes, companies that hire people who are here on a youth experience scheme will point to the positive impact that individual had. What they don't have is the counterfactual of the person they might have employed if that person hadn't left the country to go to another country on the similar experience scheme to go somewhere else. I think the one thing I'd watch out for is geography. So I would assume that the geography of the people who would apply to go to Europe would be more spread out than where people would choose to go to when they come in. And they would probably concentrate around larger cities, those sorts of more touristy hotspots. If they're there for a experience of the UK, it probably follows more of a tourism pattern. Now, that might help and support the hospitality and tourism industry, because their demand pops up in the same areas, right? So there's a bit of a matching there. But I don't think anyone's thinking this is going to be helping, hard to fill vacancies in the food manufacturing sector in a rural part somewhere in the Midlands.
So you don't think that this might
If that's
fill
not going to be where people would choose to position themselves on a youth mobility scheme.
right?
So
So you don't
geography is
see,
probably the
okay.
main thing where I'd see a difference happening here.
You don't see this helping to plug the gaps that we had with fashion manufacturing, where a lot of those skills come from Eastern European trained staff, mainly from Lithuania and Poland. You don't see it helping with that?
It would really depend on where you were located, I think. If you were somewhere where somebody would move to for a youth experience scheme, and you had, because if you chose where you were going to go based on where you wanted to live for a few years and experience the UK, the employers you would touch into would be around that area, rather than picking an employer from overseas and going, I'm going to go to that employer and go wherever in the country I need to go to get there. I think they probably pick place first. And I hear, it's Charlie would be better placed to speak on this, but we have a number of universities within our membership as well, and a number of them will say a student will pick the UK before they pick a university. Then they'll probably even pick a part of the country before they pick a university, and then they'll pick which university for a lot of those choices. So it's sort of place before individual study or employment outcome, perhaps.
Thank you. Charlie, do you have any points before I go to Simon, who I think is going to go to Rachel? No. Okay. Back to the chair. Thank you.
I'm going to do just that. Thanks, Tamara. Rachel, vested interest from the cities of London and Westminster, or a wider point?
Well, perhaps not vested, but perhaps just attuned. Matthew, I was struck by what you said. Is it based? And this is no a genuine data question. Is your position based on evidence or perfectly reasonable assumptions that of attitudes to what a youth experience in the UK would be like in terms of being drawn to the big cities? Because I understand your argument, but I'm interested to know whether it's data and evidence based or just a reasonable argument.
No, yes, evidence, but no, not surveys or something you say as like an official statistic. So an awful lot of what we get will be coming, what are the stories that come through from our membership? And when we're speaking to the businesses in our membership, they will say, actually, we see greater propensity of the use of these schemes in the countries that already have schemes like this, where you're more likely to pick those up in certain sort of larger cities, particularly London. I think your parallel where you have more data would probably be in the student population, because as Brian said, you don't have good data on exactly youth mobility visas for other countries. Who are they working for? Where are they working? Where are they living? That isn't a data set that I've seen. But certainly I'm basing my point more on what do our members say to us about where they see impacts, and they will say they disproportionately see them in larger cities.
I would love to see some of that written down, and I'm sure the Commission would. Anything that you've got available and written down, I think would be useful.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Tamara. And Rachel, Charlie, did you want just to come in off the back of that conversation? I think you might have something.
Yeah, on Matthew's point about kind of students, we don't see the visa status. So we don't see the visa status of, we'll see where the student comes from, but we won't necessarily see I don't think we have data on the visa status for existing YMS schemes. But I think what we can do is I can certainly look and dig out the kind of distributions of European students coming on degree level provision and share that. I think that would be, certainly from the kind of study aspect, but I would definitely agree with others' points around, the sort of, visibility, geography being a really important part. If you're a European youth, you're going to be thinking about place. You're going to be thinking about somewhere that has a pretty big kind of labour market where you can expect to pick up work, and places that you're already familiar with. So I think, I would kind of second that point from a sort of, empirical basis.
Thank you. So, talking of place, I'm going to now pass over to another parliamentary colleague from another place, which I'm sure has just as many reasons for people to come to occupy it. So Simon Hoare, who's one of the Members of Parliament for Conservative Members of Parliament for Dorset, which is, of course, beautiful, attractive, appealing, and a wonderful place to work. Simon.
Yes, but Mr. Hughes, that's enough about me. Thank you. And I suppose in asking this question, I should declare an interest in that my eldest daughter is currently applying for a place at university. But I think my question is directed principally to Charlie Robinson, which is, can you just flesh out, you referenced in answer to an earlier question, you mentioned in passing higher education funding, but I'd just like you to flesh that out as to how the scheme might interact with other priorities such as higher education funding, both in terms of the pros and potential pitfalls that we should be alert to.
Sorry, just trying to unmute myself there. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think the main thing to be aware of here is just that, you know, we're in a very sort of precarious situation in terms of higher education funding at the moment. We've seen there's a variety of factors. It's kind of a number of different things contributing to this at the moment. But, you know, we've seen the real terms value of domestic tuition fees. That's eroded by a third, 32% erosion in the value of the domestic tuition fee in the last decade between 2015 and 2025. According to OFS track data, English universities lost 1.7 billion in teaching domestic students in the academic year 2023-2024. So there's a real issue there. I think expanding home fee status to include European students would really greatly exacerbate this problem. We know that, you know, international student tuition fee revenues cross-subsidise important research. Again, OFS track data shows that universities' cost recovery on research is only 67% at the moment. We have seen the government, you know, very welcome pledge to uplift domestic tuition fees, but we've seen cuts to other areas and increased costs in other areas mean that's basically swallowed up. So we've seen, you know, big increase in NI contributions and teachers' pension scheme. We've seen cuts to the strategic priorities grant, capital funding for teaching, cuts to funding for foundation years and apprenticeships. You know, all in all, this kind of, you know, it contributes to a bit of a perfect storm. We've also got the proposal, you know, we're highly supportive of the government reintroducing maintenance grants, but we have a proposed 6% levy on international student tuition fees to do that, which we would argue, you know, while maintenance grants are important, is not the best way to do it. Very concerned that it could push, you know, additional universities into deficit. And also critically that it reduces funding to do all those social goods like research, civic engagement, domestic teaching. So yeah, a real sort of perfect storm going on. I think picking up on Brian's point, there's also the question, a very real question for us about parity with international students, on what basis we could grant preferential access and how that would go down with other international students that are really the kind of lifeblood of the existing higher education funding system. I think there's also, for us, another question about the possible knock-on impacts on domestic places, given that now, you know, in that environment, situation where you would have EU students accessing home fees, these would then both need cross-subsidising from international non-EU student fees, and that would compound what we already have, which is an over-reliance, a structural over-reliance on international fees. It's not clear how any home fee status could be kind of linked just to the youth experience scheme. So I think we'd have to assume that it would be talking about, you know, changes to the current UK regulations around fees eligibility and would apply to all EU students. So I think, yeah, some big challenges. And because they could be students coming, if it did happen that it was applying to all EU students and not in some way linked to a youth experience scheme, then you're talking about students coming in on student visas, access to the graduate route. You know, there could be, it could ramp up both short-term net migration as well as compounding, you know, financial problems for universities.
Okay, thank you. Not wishing to diminish the financial impact on universities, is there which is obviously key, is there the potential that the scheme proposed may be sort of negatively received in the media, wider public, etc., if a narrative could be created which underscores the importance of sorting out the baseline funding for higher and further education, that fewer places are available to sort of homegrown Brits, if I can use that phrase, rather than people coming from overseas, therefore making it seem slightly unbalanced in the first instance, but also inhibiting a perfectly legitimate governmental drive from whoever is got the keys of number 10 to increase and improve the skills base of UK PLC so we can exploit those opportunities directly?
I think there's a very real risk. You know, we've seen there's a lot of sensitivity in there's a pretty good public awareness now of the fact that international student tuition fees are vital, you know, in providing cross subsidy for domestic places. That point is now pretty well understood, and the polling data will show that. There's huge sensitivity around the idea of kind of international students displacing home students. We see that every year. It pops up around kind of UCAS. You know, every year in UCAS admissions is highly sensitive issue. So yes, I absolutely do think that there would be public concern if EU students are suddenly seen in any way to be putting pressure on supply of domestic places. I think there's a very real risk there.
Thank you. Do you have a sort of silver bullet, a sort of solution, if the journalist was to stick a microphone under your nose and say, now, come on, Charlie, what's the one thing that the government could do in order to ensure that that scenario either doesn't manifest itself or is manifested in itself into such a small scale as to be almost invisible?
I think, you know, there's the question, putting aside for one moment the question of the sort of, you know, structural funding issues, because that's a huge thing, and there's already work in train that the government's already doing in that space. I think just on the point about the youth experience scheme visa, I think it needs to be sustainable. It needs to work and operate on its own terms. I think there may be some more that we could do to look around, like there may be some more that we could do to look around kind of what other sort of other ways of funding it might be. But I think essentially it needs to operate on its own terms. And, you know, I think if it's such an important thing to have some kind of a reduced fee rates, then we could look at kind of scholarships package associated with it. You know, universities already deliver a huge package of scholarships to European and international students. It's absolutely massive. And if it were really important to have this kind of scholarship provision attached, then it would be reasonable to ask each side to fund or provide scholarships to support its own students. I don't think that's outside the bounds of possibility. I think it would be a reasonable requirement, and it's something that the Commission could achieve, you know, and I think we could, as a sector, definitely get behind something like that.
Charlie, thank you very much. That's very helpful. Thank you. Nothing else from me, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Matthew, I think you would like to come in before we move on to the next question. Thanks. Thanks very much, Simon.
Well, I was just going to add, of course, thinking about how trade negotiations affect different sectors where they're, you know, where the costs and the benefits occur are often in different sectors. I think just to say from a cross economy perspective that we'd support Charlie's point around saying, in the end, if what you do here, where we're saying the broader benefit is what does it unlock in the broader EU-UK relationship through a youth experience scheme, if something on fees had to come up there, the overriding priority for the HE sector and the rest of the economy needs a thriving HE sector for the skills development point you were making, is whatever you do, don't put the financial sustainability of the higher education sector at risk with what you do. But of course, you could be creative in the ways in which you think about addressing it. And, you know, we have also given a strong steer from that cross-economy perspective into the government that we think that the international student levy that they're talking about bringing in is a particularly a bad idea. And therefore, you know, you can think about other ways in which, if you thought there was a sufficient economic advantage in other areas to justify making changes around fees in order to unlock that benefit, you can be creative in how you make sure that you don't have the negative impact on the financial sustainability of higher education when doing so. And it's taking everything in the round rather than only line by line. But certainly supporting Charlie's point around how do we make sure that what we have in total for policy for HE adds up to a sustainable future finances for our higher education sector.
Thank you. I'm grateful.
Thanks, Matthew. And thanks, Simon.
Rachel, coming at you with a slightly different
focus now on different sorts of issues, but all part of the jigsaw. So Rachel, back to you.
Very much. We've explored a little bit of this in terms of the overall impact to the economy, but could I start off by asking you, Matthew, what you understand would be the impact on UK GDP? The Chancellor has described an ambitious youth experience scheme. We know that to really get underneath this, we need to know the design, but could you expand a bit on previous comments around the impact on UK GDP, please, Matthew?
Yeah, look, I'll speak more about the nature of impact rather than the quantum of impact, because a little bit like Brian was saying earlier on, the design of a system, the numbers, these sorts of things really matter to what the quantum would be. But something to say on nature, we've already spoken about how it's probably not about labour market impacts if people are roughly in and out in equal numbers. And therefore, things like tax revenues, if the people who are leaving would have been working and paying taxes, the people arriving are working and paying taxes, that probably nets off broadly equally as well. Where we see the impacts and the benefits are, if you're going abroad and gaining an experience, you're probably bringing back connections and skills that are not just about the value achieved for the duration of the placement and the duration of the experience, but it is something that you then leverage throughout the remainder of your career. In the opposite direction, there is a big soft power dimension to this for us, which is if there are people who are sort of the future business leaders of multinational corporations overseas who have come and had a positive experience of the UK, there is a soft power element to that, which does, again, a lot of this, as I say, is based on the conversations that we have with businesses. But I think back to some particularly prominent conversations I've had with American-owned companies before, where they have said the fact that a typical development path for a US executive is if you really want to get on, you need to have spent some time in a foreign market in a number of these companies. Often they'll pick the UK as the place to come and do that placement, ease of language, more similar cultures, these sorts of things. But then going back, having had a positive experience of the UK, then means that sometimes the UK is winning future investment decisions that on, the purely rational assessment, it was probably a 50-50 call and could have gone either way, but we won more than our fair share because of that soft power element. So I think there is a skill development for the people we're sending out. There is a soft power element for the people who are temporarily coming and then going home, hopefully with a positive experience of the UK. That's on the moves of the people themselves. And then the rest of the growth impact is what does having a positive conversation with the EU about this achieve for the wider negotiations, whether it's SPS agreement or other matters. And I think that they are the factors we think more about in terms of impact on growth, rather than things like the labour market impacts or the tax receipts of the people while they're here, because to Brian's point, we're expecting probably in and out on broadly equal numbers.
Thanks, Matthew. Brian, you were quite dismissive of the potential impact on the economy. Do you want to, after this discussion, would you change that, or anything else to add or to what Matthew said about impacts on UK GDP?
Don't want to disagree with the Chancellor. I think Matthew's broadly right. I mean, I would say that I think even the soft power arguments, I think they're probably true. You've got to remember, an awful lot of the people on youth mobility schemes are not going to be leaders in the future. They're going to be people who just did a year abroad or 2 years abroad and then have perfectly normal jobs like the rest of us. And actually, on that sort of stuff, the more important visas and immigrations are things like the global business mobility route. The real leaders in the US who run companies, the reason they have foreign experience is they came as part of that company and spent 2 years in Google's London office before heading back to Google's San Francisco headquarters. So I think they're much more important than you. Youth Mobility Scheme will have an awful lot of people who just take as a holiday or a work holiday, and that's all it's going to be. So I don't think we should over-egg that. I mean, in terms of GDP effect, it fundamentally just depends on the numbers. As long as it's balanced, the effect will be roughly zero. If it's not balanced, and if it's not balanced, it has to be non-balanced in favour of us getting more people just because of the population differences. It'll have an effect on GDP. So could I imagine a world in which it's if we take the word ambitious to mean hundreds of thousands of Europeans coming every year relative to 50,000 or so Brits going, yeah, that'll have an effect on GDP, and, you know, % or two, you could easily imagine in the longer run. As I say, that seems inconsistent with the government's net migration objectives, so I'm not sure how you balance those two. On the tax side, that would then feed through, if it was really ambitious, it would feed through to more tax revenue. I would say two things. First of all, the idea that it will remove the need for tax rises in the November budget is not my understanding of where the government currently are with the OBR. But I think the other thing is that there are some additional benefits to these schemes, even if it was balanced, and which is that at least under the current sort of schemes that we have, people have to pay the immigration health surcharge when they come from abroad. Our sense is they don't use the National Health Service very much at all. And therefore, that's gain to the National Health Service because it's a fee that British people wouldn't be paying if they were still in the UK. But if they've gone abroad and we've replaced them with foreign people who are paying the immigration health surcharge, that's a benefit. Presumably, some of these people will bring money with them in terms of part of it is a holiday. So they'll spend revenue just as normal tourists would do. And so that's a VAT revenue. And of course, they won't be eligible for benefits. And so if you're replacing a Brit who goes abroad who would otherwise have claimed universal credit, that's a benefit to the tax system as well. So at the margin, replacing Brits with foreigners under a youth mobility scheme is positive for the tax and benefit system. But the numbers would have to be really big for it to make a significant effect. And for it to fundamentally change the November budget would require astronomical numbers to arrive very quickly as well. So that's probably not going to happen.
Thanks very much. Back over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much. Okay, it was my question now, very exciting. So this is a question to Charlie, and others may want to come in. Charlie, what do you think should the government have in its mind? You've talked a bit about all the implications of overseas student finance and fees and so on and so forth. But if we're to go back into Erasmus, then we're going to have to pay a fee. We paid a fee before, and we've obviously missed the boat for the current 7-year cycle, but we would have to pay a fee either for the one after that or coming in halfway. What are the considerations that the UK negotiators will need to think about when they work out how much we should be willing to pay? And you may want to comment both on the, as it were, the financial and strategic considerations. There may be some political considerations too, and then I think it may be helpful to hear from Brian as well as a follow-up to that.
I think just in terms of on this point around kind of timelines, you know, the negotiations are happening right now. I think it's still not ruled out a potential rejoin to the last year of the current programme, so the 2027 funding call. Meetings happening in Brussels this month, which will be really critical. The deadline to rejoin in 2027 would be at the end of the month, so it's all kind of all systems go at the moment. If a deal isn't reached in time to rejoin the 2027 programme, we would be looking at the successor programme, the 2834 programme, but that's just a kind of note on timelines. I think in terms of like what considerations the government should consider when thinking about negotiating a fee to rejoin, you know, I think we're really supportive of the UK rejoining Erasmus. It's going to provide that kind of critical long-term sustainable funding for student staff mobility and exchanges. Yeah, it's kind of very, very supportive. It obviously needs to be a fair and a contribution that can be justified in terms of that sort of public perceptions as well. In the current funding formula, contributions are based on a country's GDP, and funding allocations up to the national agencies are based at least in part on a country's sending capability and record of participation in the programme. I think we know that the government is looking at both of those elements in tandem, so it's looking carefully at both money in and thinking about discounting on the fee. It's also looking at kind of the money out elements and transparency around that. I think, you know, the money in element is important, but the money element out, I think, is just as important. And on that, I think what we would say is that in the years since the EU referendum, you know, Erasmus and outward student mobility has dramatically increased in visibility. We've seen the fact that we've got evidence on the kind of skills and employability gain for students. That's been really important in driving this. And in those years since, universities have really embedded it into their global opportunity strategies and internationalization strategies. So I think we've seen year-on-year increases before the pandemic in the numbers of outwardly mobile British students. And it dipped in the pandemic, but we have seen numbers absolutely picking up again afterwards. So I would say don't let past performance be the judge of how we would engage in future. We've seen the Turing funding scheme has been heavily oversubscribed every year. Providers get around 45 to 50% of their bid. I think rejoining Erasmus really gives us the scope to be really ambitious here. So I think the money out element and transparency is just as important as the entry fee. I think the other point on that kind of wider strategic thing, we obviously need to look at the Erasmus programme in the round. I think the value here isn't just about it's not just about the money in elements. There's the role of Erasmus in unlocking. We can't underestimate the importance of Erasmus to European stakeholders. It really, really matters to them. It's been a huge pain point since we left Erasmus. So I think it's a very powerful lever in the UK's armoury and in these trade negotiations. And I think just going back and circling back to kind of points that I think Brian has made, I see it very much through this lens of the government's kind of opportunity and skills pillars. This is, it's a huge, it's not just about money. It's about, it is about soft power, I think, Erasmus very much. And it's about opportunity and skills. You've got that kind of, it's not a zero-sum game when you have people, young people moving between countries. There's that effect of brain circulation and skills. So yeah, I think it's very much about kind of this wider benefits.
And just before bringing Brian in, do you have
any insider intelligence that suggests a percentage chance of success in the negotiations which have been finished at the end of this month? Sounds like a tight deadline to me, but
what do you know?
I couldn't possibly comment. But we're obviously very hopeful, and I think both sides are kind of working hard to try and reach a swift agreement.
Brilliant. There will be some other sorts of flags.
So we'll go up if that's achieved. Brian, any quick comments
on Erasmus specifically?
I mean, I think I broadly agree. I think kind of the evidence that Charlie was talking about kind of the benefits of that international experience in terms of future wage progression and future employment rates and that kind of thing. That matters because you can then, at least conceptually, you can turn that into a fiscal gain over the lifetime of someone from getting that experience relative to someone who doesn't. Although it's quite hard to really prove that you've got a comparison group that's actually, these are not random experiments where you're randomly giving someone the international experience and not giving it to someone else, and therefore you can actually work out the true effect of the experience. But with that caveat, you can work out the fiscal gain in the long run, and the government could end up saying, well, actually, we make more in the long run from doing this than it costs. So I think, that's an important part of the calculation. I mean, the only thing I would say is that it sort of goes back to Simon's point earlier, that really you need to solve the whole university funding issue. And this is just yet another part of it in terms of, public money having to be used for something. And while you might always say, it's a good idea to spend public money on this part of the university system or that part, in the end, that's public money that we don't, in some sense, have. And so, there's a risk sometimes in doing these things, almost like salami slicing, that we forget that we've got to go back to actually having a policy that deals with the underlying university funding issue and the structure of universities in the UK. And I think that's, it's too late to do anything about that before we have to negotiate Erasmus. But I mean, it's unhelpful in some sense that we just keep on putting off the really big questions for universities in terms of funding.
Okay, thank you very much for getting to have one last transfer over to
Dorset, Simon, for a final question from you.
And then I'm hoping we'll have time for a quick last question to you all when we've had that. So Simon, over to you again.
Thank you, Chair. I think sometimes these things can often be seen as the purview of the children of the sharp-elbowed middle classes. So I suppose that the question I wanted to ask is, how can we ensure that the scheme balances the eligibility criteria and financial requirements, but also ensure it is genuinely accessible to young people from all backgrounds?
Who do you want to go first, Simon?
I suppose that might be, probably to Charlie first and then to Matthew, I would have thought.
I think, there are different, in terms of widening access, there are obviously a kind of different barriers to participation. There are financial ones, there are cultural ones. They're from I'm thinking about it with a kind of education hat on and thinking about, students coming into the UK HE system through the scheme. I think the application to study is a sort of separate process, but assuming that, students do come into the HE system using the Youth Experience Scheme, universities have huge expertise in widening access. It's a very tightly regulated part of what we do. I think university admissions teams are very well set up to be able to assess students' academic credentials, taking into account their background. And many provide support to students, not just domestic students, but also international students who've come from non-traditional routes to support that transition. I think on the financial side, there's a cost attached to the visa. I think the current ones are about £331 for the visa application fee. And then there's the immigration health surcharge at, I think, £776. That's not an insubstantial sort of upfront visa cost that students would have to navigate. But on the sort of, on the kind of finance element for students, I mean, universities, as I've said, they offer an absolutely vast package of scholarships, bursaries, and fee discounts to international and EU students that are targeted very much around different cohorts to try and mitigate the impact of the international fee level and support students from international backgrounds. So we would fully expect to be able to, students on Youth Experience Scheme should be able to access a lot of that support. We don't have much in the way of centralised data on scholarships, but just as one example here, one university in the north of England was offering £14 million in international and European scholarships 1 year. And I think Cambridge University's total scholarship funds for European and international students was 44 million in 2023-2024. So there is a lot of money there that can be used to support students.
Thank you. And Mr. Percival, did you have a thought or two on that?
Well, only a thought or two, because it doesn't feel like it's principally something that employers are thinking about necessarily, because this is then about how are individuals basing their choices about whether to go overseas or not on these sorts of experience schemes. But there can be some lessons you draw across from things like where employers are trying to make sure that their recruitment can draw on the broadest breadth of talent in the country and those sorts of questions. That's how employers experience those sorts of issues. The one thing I think I would say, though, is that our immigration system is often designed to be thinking, what's the net fiscal contribution of the people that come in? The phrase brightest and best has been popular of successive governments rather than only being associated with one party or another. But when we're talking about Youth Experience Scheme, we are talking about something where whatever we do is probably going to be something the EU is also looking for as well. So when you get to the design of the system, if it turns out that both the UK and the EU are putting barriers up in terms of fees and charges, and then both spending money developing scholarship systems to erode the fees and charges, maybe we should have gone back to that principle of simple earlier on and said, why are we both erecting barriers and then erecting ladders to climb over the barriers for our respective sides, rather than just thinking, how do we prioritize keeping a system as simple as possible, if that's what we're going to do? And you're thinking about this less as a migration route and more as a what is this as a chip within the broader negotiations for the future EU-UK relationship?
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And we've just got time, happily, for one last question, which
I'll ask Charlie first, then Matthew, and then Brian. And it is, if you had one ask of the government on youth mobility schemes tomorrow, what would it be? Charlie, go for it.
I think there was just one ask of the UK government on a youth mobility scheme. Sorry, I couldn't hear you terribly well, Simon. But I think, I think it would be to regard it as it's a positive opportunity. I think I've made my point clear, but please don't do anything that would kind of exacerbate the existing sort of funding issues for the UK higher education sector.
Matthew?
I would say think about it in the round. and remember that this is something that fits into the broader mix of conversations around the EU-UK relationship, and this can be that. This can be something that builds a foundation of trust to build on and is a bit of a political olive branch to extend and try and unlock those benefits in other areas rather than a narrow assessment based on each line individually. It's a trade negotiation, everything hangs together.
Thank you very much. And Brian, what would you greet the Prime Minister with when he returns from India as your one ask?
Don't forget your commitment on net migration. Immigration remains about the most politically sensitive issue in the UK. And I think you would fall into very serious issues if you made the scheme uncapped and extremely asymmetric in terms of numbers. That would, I think, harm public confidence, both in the immigration system, but also in the youth mobility scheme. So I think you need to be realistic about the numbers. And, even just going back to something Charlie mentioned earlier, she was saying that, most people leave, and she's completely right. And, the estimates are perhaps 20% of people stay. That doesn't sound a lot, but if you had 100,000 people a year, that's 20,000 people staying every year, long term. If your objective was, and this is not the government objective, but if the objective of the government was 100,000 net migration a year, if you've already given 20,000 of it away on a youth mobility scheme, then, what are you going to do on family visas? What are you going to do on work visas? So I think it's all got to be thought of in the round within a context of commitment to reducing net migration.
That's a very salutary, no nonsense, valid response. So thank you all very much indeed, Brian, Matthew and Charlie, for your contributions as witnesses. Really valuable. We will not just listen to them now and assimilate that, but we will digest that, and we will, with our team, decide where we go with that. But that's really valuable. It's a hugely important issue for all of us. It's one of the signs that there may be an improvement in relations with our European Union colleagues. We know about the difficulties on the other side of the channel, but for us this is a really important issue, and we prioritize it. You obviously do each in your work. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for taking part, and you're now free to go and do whatever the rest of Thursday has in store for you. We will look forward to engaging with you, I'm sure, in other ways in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you all very much.